Alright, in this video we're going to talk about the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Now before your head goes spinning on this one, let me explain this in slightly simpler terms. Okay, let's go back with a little computer history. Alright, if you will recall, I used to work on what is called an NCR mainframe. Now, NCR is an acronym for National Cash Register. And I bet you're sitting there going, wait a minute, National Cash Register? That's right. In the olden days, they used to have cash registers, and some of them were manufactured by the National Cash Register Corporation. Well, as the 1970s and the 1980s came along, the National Cash Register Company started building mainframes. And they started installing them in office buildings. And they also started manufacturing things called dumb terminals. Now when you came to dumb terminals, all they were capable of doing was sending information from the dumb terminal to the NCR mainframe and receiving information from the NCR mainframe. Now I know there were other mainframes around back in that time, but National Cash Register was one of the manufacturers of those mainframes. Okay, so we're going to discuss specifically NCR mainframes. Other mainframes did similar things, so just bear with me. Okay, so we have an illustration here. We're going to pretend that this great big box is an NCR mainframe. Now we have four dumb terminals. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and wires hooked up from the dumb terminals to the NCR mainframe. So let's say you wanted to process payroll. Okay, the payroll information was stored here, not here. Now when people got onto this, it looked like the information was stored on the dumb terminal, but it wasn't. It was actually stored here. Because remember, dumb terminals could only send and receive information. They couldn't process anything. Alright, so let's say somebody's sitting at this dumb terminal and they want to process payroll. So they send an instruction from here to here and say, process payroll. And this thing will actually process payroll. And when it's done, it sends that information back to dumb terminal number 1. Now, how would it know which one to send it to? Well, there are cards in every one of these where the wire's plugged into. And these cards would say, this is terminal number 1, this is terminal number 2, 3, and 4. And that's how the NCR mainframe knew which one to send it to. Okay? Because when it processed payroll, it wasn't going to send it to all 4. It was just going to send it to 1. And that's what it did. Alright. Now this was all fine and dandy back in the 70s and the early 80s when your computers were located in office buildings. Well, then we came out with the personal computer. That's when the problems began. Because now everybody had a computer. But not everybody had a server. Now, you say, well, what about those people who had a computer in the late 1980s and in the 1990s? Say, the latter half of the 20th century and the very earliest part of the 21st century. Well, what happened? I'll tell you what happened. They created something called a server-client protocol. Let me say that again. A server-client protocol. Because, you see, client computers could actually do things where dumb terminals couldn't. Client computers could help you make a word processing document. They could help you edit your pictures when you took digital pictures. They could help you design spreadsheets or create graphics on the screen. But if you wanted major processing power, you couldn't do it on a client computer. You had to send that information over to a server to let it do it. Now the first thing is, any client computer with the right kind of configuration could be turned into a server computer at any time. That's a fact. Alright, so it wasn't that client computers couldn't do anything. It's just a matter of sharing what was in your client computer with other computers around the world. So now they were sticking network cards into client computers. And those network cards enabled client computers to talk to other computers around the world. But the way they did it was this. Let's say you had a picture on your computer and you wanted to share it with every person on the West Coast. Say you lived on the East Coast and you wanted to share your picture with everybody on the West Coast. Well, what your computer would do is it would send that picture to a server that was on the West Coast. And then that server would send that picture to every client computer on the West Coast. It was like A, B, and C. A was the client computer on the East Coast, which sent the picture to the server on the West Coast, which was B, and then B would send that picture all the way over to those client computers on the West Coast, which would be C, 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 C. Okay? All right. Now, this started working like the post office. It would be like if you were trying to do a mass mailing. Okay, let's say you wanted to mail a whole bunch of advertisements to people on the West Coast. Well, if you knew all of their addresses, you would just address all those envelopes with your address and theirs, and then just mail them off through the post office. Remember, you're not the one delivering those pieces of mail to every single person on the West Coast because you live on the East Coast. What are you going to do? Climb on an airplane, fly to the West Coast, and visit every single house on the West Coast to distribute your advertisements? No. You would give them to the post office, who then in turn would distribute the flyers. So if we go back to my original illustration, we can say you are the client computer on the East Coast, the post office would be like the server, and then the people's houses on the West Coast would be the client computers on the West Coast. Client, server, client. And that's why addresses were developed. Internet Protocol addresses, that's what they're called. The computer on the East Coast has an Internet Protocol address. The server has an Internet Protocol address. And all those computers on the West Coast have Internet Protocol addresses. Okay, so what does all this have to do with the dynamic host dynamic host configuration protocol? Okay, not everybody likes to have a static IP address. And here's the reason why. When you start having a static IP address, what happens is that people that like to create malware or viruses or Trojan horses, they can find you, they can infect your computer and effectively destroy it. So, what they did was they created these servers. Remember I was talking like the post office, they created these servers. The post offices have like P.O. boxes. That's a good way to illustrate this. Post offices have P.O. boxes, so your real address isn't revealed to the rest of the world. Well, that's the same way servers work when you're dealing with a dynamic host configuration protocol. Okay? So this server has these P.O. boxes, and they assign one to your computer. That way you can send and receive information back and forth from yourself to computers on the West Coast without the computers on the West Coast being able to detect exactly where you are. Isn't that nice? And every time you unplug your Ethernet cable and plug it back in, you're assigned a different IP address. And if you turn your computer completely off and you turn it back on, you're assigned a different IP address. And that's how the dynamic host configuration protocol works. It will assign you, this server in Timbuktu will assign you a different IP address every time you shut your computer off, every time you unplug your Ethernet cable, that kind of thing. And there you go. And that's how that works. So when you're talking about the dynamic host configuration protocol, just think of it as a P.O. box at a post office. Only every time you unplug your cord or you turn off your computer, well, you're going to get a different IP address. You won't do that at the post office, but you will with that. And that way, people that want to create malware or Trojan horses or viruses are going to have a lot harder time tracing your computer down and infecting your computer. They might infect the server because the server has a static IP address, but they won't affect you. They won't infect you. Whew. Okay. Does that clear it up a little bit for you? I hope so. Anyway, if you get an error about the dynamic host configuration protocol, it's probably because there's something wrong with your network card. Remember, you have to have a network card to access the internet, even if you're accessing it from a cable company or from your phone company. Doesn't matter. Whoever you're accessing it from, you've still got to have a network card to do that, even if it's wireless. Whether you're wired with an Ethernet cable or you're doing this wirelessly, you still got to have a network card. Also, your IP address will change if something goes wrong with your router. If you disconnect your router, if you lose power, you're going to have a different IP address. That's how that works. All right. If you have any questions about this, leave them in the comments section below. I will tell you more in a future video, so stay tuned.